Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Department of Economics Post-Budget Forum. This is run under the Demas-Rampersad seminar series. I am Dr. Deonanan. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Economics, and today I'm joining you as a moderator of this event. First, I bring you greetings from the department, and it is a pleasure to be here with you all today to discuss a very important matter, which is the budget 2022 budget statement as read by the Honorable Minister of Finance. Certainly in this pandemic period, we've seen something that has touched every sphere of economic life, and negatively so. It has impacted health, education, the viability of small and medium enterprises, national debt levels, availability of foreign exchange, among many, many other consequences. And so it is against this backdrop that indeed the budget as read is an important facet of how we navigate and how we move forward. So we are here today we have assembled a team of experts from here at the university, and I'll introduce you all to them shortly. But we are here to discuss from their perspectives, insights into that budget presentation. Before I introduce them and their various fields of expertise, I'd remind members how we look as economists, how we look at budget. And that is, a budget is really a developmental tool. It is a plan that we report on annually that moves us towards some plan of development. It is an important budget because of the pandemic period. It is also important against a backdrop of concerns over the energy sector. And so it is with pleasure that I introduce this panel that has multifaceted expertise. First up today, we have Dr. Roger Hussein, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Economics, well known certainly at the national and regional level. His field of expertise is in trade and economic development. He serves actually right now as a coordinator of a specialized unit, trade and economic development. He has worked with institutions within the country, but certainly regionally, such as CARICOM, the Caribbean Development Bank, Regional Negotiating Machinery, World Trade Organization, among many other organizations. So his perspective, and we are pleased to have him join us today, is certainly grounded in the trade and economic development sphere. He's going to be our first panelist joining us in a minute. We have Seerattan, Dr. Dave Seerattan, who is a lecturer in the Department of International Relations. Dave is an economist, a well-known economist within the country and within the region as well, whose specific field is monetary and financial economics. He was formerly head of the Caribbean Center for Money and Finance, which is a specialized unit dedicated to research within the money and financial sector field. He has previously served in many roles, but certainly within the cabinet appointed member of the financial sector issues in the country, and that dealing with the region. So he has many years of experience within the monetary and financial field, and his views will be grounded in that from that perspective. And finally, but certainly not least in any way, we have Dr. Marlene Attzs, who is a lecturer in the Department of Economics. Dr. Attzs is an expert at sustainable development, right? And that's her field of specialty. She is certainly well known, again, like our other speakers, nationally and regionally. She has been a consultant at different various multilateral agencies. And most recently, she has been a member of the Economic Development Board, as well as special advisor to the principal. So we have individuals here who have wide experiences nationally, regionally, and experts at different fields. And we are pleased to join you all to share insights into the post-budget, into the budget presentation that was read. At this stage, let me turn it over to Dr. Hussein.
Good morning, all. I thank you very much for the invitation. I haven't spoken at this seminar for a few years, so I look forward to being involved again. It's certainly a pleasure. This is our department. This is what we do, and it's a pleasure to get the opportunity once more to speak at home and to speak to our students and to the people that participate in these university seminars. I would share my screen here. Regan, just to verify that you all are seeing it.
We are seeing yes.
Right, so I'm going to go into full mode and I'm going to start. So I won't spend a long time running up to the crease. I will just get straight into it. So the way I see it is we have three fundamental problems in this country. Well, of course, there would be more, but the three issues that I would like to see any budget tackle is growth. We haven't had growth since 2008-9 in any real way in Trinidad and Tobago. And the second factor is we have had persistent fiscal deficits, and we need to bring the fiscal deficit, certainly the non-energy fiscal deficit, close to zero. Starting first with the fiscal deficit and then the non-energy fiscal deficit, we need to bring it close to zero, and then we need to address concerns in the labor market. Now, Regan introduced that my specialty is trade. There is an aspect of trade that deals with boom in factor markets. One of the boom in the factor market we are currently experiencing in Trinidad and Tobago is with Venezuelan immigrant labor. So I would try to integrate that into my conversation. Now, before actually delving into everything, I looked at the structure of the economy. I used TTSNA data, which is the old format, instead of TTISIC revision 4, which is the new format, because the continuous sampling survey of the population labor data is not aligned with the TTISIC version of national accounts. So I was forced to use the old TTSNA version, which I reconstructed. And here you could see that the substantial part, I divided the economy into three parts: booming tradable, which is petroleum; non-booming tradable, which is manufacturing; and non-tradable, which is a fancy name for services. Here you would see that the share of employment in the booming tradable sector increased, and then in the middle layer of the table, increased and then marginally decreased. In the manufacturing sector, continually decreased, and in the non-tradable services sector, it increased continuously. The last part of this table is very important. It shows output per worker. And output per worker by far is the highest in the booming tradable sector. It is also very high in the non-booming tradable sector, but although high, only about 1/10 that of the booming tradable sector. And in the non-tradable sector, it's significantly lower if you use 2018 data than in the booming tradable and the non-booming tradable sector. So just remember that in the services sector, output per worker is the lowest in the economy. Now, this year, and Regan, you told me I have 20 minutes, so I'm just keeping a track on time. This year shows the structure of the economy, and I hope most of the students are on. We are at a point A. We were at a point A in February 2020. Opening up the economy in the same format and not changing anything will bring us back to point A in, let's say, December 2021, where on point A was not a good point. Even before COVID, we had declining labor force participation rate, rising debt per capita, rising debt to GDP ratio, no economic growth, decreasing non-energy exports, and a structure of the economy that was imbalanced in favor of services, and a host of factors. The intention is either to get the economy to point B or to point C. Now, for many years, we have been trying to convince the government to take us to point C. I read the recent economic recovery document, and I suspect that would take us, if implemented, to point D, to the left of point B. So I'm not going to even focus on the economic recovery document. I'm going to focus on point C. Now, the challenge in the Trinidad for the Trinidad and Tobago economy is in the period 2009 to 2019, we were ranked amongst the worst performing economies in the world. So you would see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We were the 10th worst performing economy in the world in that time period if you look at IMF data. And if you look at the forecasted period 2020 to 2026, again using IMF data and only using countries where a full data set is available, because Venezuela did not have data after 2020, you would see we are ranked first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth worst performing economy in the world in terms of expectation. And something therefore has to be wrong with the structure of the Trinidad and Tobago. What is going on with the structure of the Trinidad and Tobago economy that is causing this kind of performance? And that's why I started off the conversation with the structure of the economy. And the structure of the economy is one in which the non-tradable sector is very large and employs the most workers. The non-booming tradable sector has a healthy level of output per worker, but has been experiencing deindustrialization. And the booming tradable, the petroleum sector, has by far the highest amount of output per worker, but has been experiencing a loss of workers. So the structure of the economy needs to be amended. This data here shows that this is the first time using the data announced by the Minister of Finance that the Trinidad and Tobago has run a 6-year consecutive period of decline since 1984, and something that has to be kept in mind. Now, one of the things that we have to be careful about in Trinidad and Tobago is the relationship between transfers and subsidies and real GDP growth. And maybe it's because it induces a bad work ethic. Maybe it's because it shifts the supply curve backward. Maybe it's because it has an implication for the labor force participation rate. But as transfers and subsidies as a percent of total expenditure increase, we have found using the data that there is a tendency for real GDP growth to fall. Now, I don't know how else to make this clearer. The facts on the floor therefore suggest that the high propensity of focus on transfers and subsidies need to be reversed in order to give the economy, breathing space for economic growth. And the strategy of collecting energy revenues between 2000 and 2020, we collected $331.5 billion in energy revenues. And in the same time period, we spent $391.5 billion on one line item, transfers and subsidies. That formula, folks, cannot work after we have stabilized the economy. So Regan is very correct. COVID-19 after 2020 induced many problems in the economy, and that may remain with us until the end of 2021 or even into 2022. And so for the present, we would need to continue spending out all the energy revenue. But beyond that, folks, we need to find a formula where we save more of our energy revenues because it's non-reproducible capital, or we invest it in very highly productive reproducible capital areas. As it stands, the current formula is not working. And because it's an intergenerational asset, you can't spend out all the energy revenues as you receive them because it's also the property of the next generation. Output per worker in the Trinidad and Tobago economy has been falling, and that is something that we need to reverse. Also, I specifically show here that as transfers and subsidies increase, the labor force participation rate, which is the third lowest in the Caribbean, has been falling. And our labor force participation rate moved from 63.4% in 2004. And as we speak, it's probably about 53%. And in the Bahamas, it's about 72%. So something has gone fundamentally wrong with the structure of the economy. And unless we take a close scientific look and understand the nature of these problems and put in place appropriate mechanisms to reverse it, we would remain struggling with some of the problems we have at present. The labor force has been declining. We have lost almost 40,000 workers from the labor force. And one of the things that we need to note is that the employment growth that has taken place since 2009 to 2020 has not been in petroleum, and I pointed out that petroleum has the highest output per worker. It has not been in manufacturing, and I pointed out that manufacturing has the highest output per worker. Some of it has been in services, and I showed that services has the lowest output per worker. So that's pointing out in the direction of asymptotic stagnancy. if you keep putting more workers in the lowest or the least productive sectors of the economy, then you can end up in a situation where you by virtue of the way the structure of employment and production takes place, you end up with asymptotic stagnancy. And so where is new employment going in the economy? Well, as we could see after 2016-17, employment in the government public service statutory board sector is increasing and employment in the private or non-government sector is falling. But I started off, as I said, with the structure of production and showed that output per worker in the services sector is much lower than output per worker in other sectors. So this pattern of employment here, therefore, has the potential to create asymptotic stagnancy. A significant amount, this is CSSP data of our university graduates are not getting jobs, and that's something we have to think carefully about as we move forward. And I show actual output per worker here in public administration and output per worker in the non-government, non-energy sector. You see the significant difference, and the point that I emphasize is that employment in public administration has been increasing while employment in the non-government sector has been falling. So here it is, you are increasing employment in the sector with the lowest, or with the lower set of output per worker, and employment in the areas with higher output per worker is falling. I did a search on the budget speech for the word unemployment, and only one thing came up, the unemployment relief program. I read the review of the economy, and it posted that the unemployment rate for the third quarter of 2020 was 5.1%. I submit that whenever we look at the unemployment rate, we must look at the size of the economically inactive population, which increased by about 60,000 between 2011 and 2019. 60,000 people dropped out of the labor force and became part of the economically inactive. Maybe I don't know what they are doing, and that's why I think we need a sound scientific inquiry into what is going on with the labor force. These are some numbers from the budget speech that the minister made. It shows that the expected growth in 2022 and 2023 will be couched on the increase in natural gas production from 2770 mmcf per day to 3370 mmcf per day. And then by 2023, he says it would stabilize around 3600 mmcf per day. Oil production is expected to increase 64,000 and then to 86,000. And at the same time, according to the World Bank latest forecast, the oil price and gas price will increase. And indeed, some say we will experience an energy commodity price super cycle in the medium term. I hope they are correct. But a lot of the balancing in the medium term is coming from the revenue side because of these numbers here. I am not satisfied that that is the way that we should balance the fiscal situation. I hope that we try to cut transfers and subsidies some more as we go along, and we don't have to reduce the size of the government expenditure. We could cut transfers and subsidies, and whatever money we shave off there, put it into capital expenditure so we could widen the supply side of the economy. So we keep the budgetary outlay at about 52 billion, but we change the structure of the outlay to increase the probability of non-energy sector export growth. So in closing, I think we need to consider registering all the Venezuelan workers as they are working predominantly in the informal, non-tradable part of the economy, because if you are unregistered, you will go to the informal part of the economy, and most of them, if you look at the data tracking matrices of the IOM, are in the non-tradable sector. We need to consider reducing the ratio of public sector employment to private sector employment that would lead to asymptotic stagnancy, given the labor productivity data I shared earlier. We need to design a formula that increases manufacturing sector output built around the e-tech parks. I played a role in helping to design the strategic medium-term plan for the manufacturing sector, but the focus that the people there wanted was on output. I am saying that we need to also focus on employment. And given the substantive labor productivity difference between the services sector and the manufacturing sector, if we increase output, employment in the manufacturing sector, it could really be transformative. And I think the announcements of the e-tech park made in the budget is a start. All of my comments here, Regan, are based on the assumption that people will take the vaccine. If they don't take the vaccine and the labor force participation rate remains significantly compromised, and we're going to stop-go cycles of lockdown, we cannot grow. The economy will remain compromised. I think we need in the medium-term period to move ourselves away from balancing from balancing the overall budget to bringing the non-energy fiscal balance down to zero. That's my perspective. Build up the HSF and use the investment income that was so very useful during the lockdown of the COVID-19, main part of the COVID-19 period that just went, and use the investment income therein to strengthen reproducible capital investment. I think this budget was a step in the right direction. You heard much more commentary on the non-tradable side of the economy. You saw much more incentives to strengthen small and medium-sized businesses. And so, whilst I make these comments, I hope that throughout the year, dialogue could continue to take place between the relevant stakeholders from civil society, the technocrats at the university, the technocrats in the various ministries, and equilibrium would be found that could put this economy back on a realistic, sustainable growth path. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hussein, Roger, a very interesting presentation there. But let me turn very quickly over to Dr. Seerattan, the next panelist. Dr. Seerattan.
Thank you, Chair. I want to extend a pleasant good morning to all our participants as well as fellow panelists. When we are discussing budgets is a snapshot into a component of the overall economic strategy that the government of the day has kind of mapped out for in the medium term for the next 5 years. So the budget is really some signal as to where the government wants to take the economy. I'm glad that Dr. Hussein kind of went into a little detail into some of the structural features of the Trinidad and Tobago economy, and we all, as economists, we all understand all the structural weaknesses that we face that contribute to some of the economic problems that we face. But in the context of the budget and the context of where we need to go, I think there's some important overarching themes that we need to take account of. And those overarching themes, for better or for worse, are that one, the government is more comfortable with a relatively stable exchange rate. The government and the central bank is also very concerned about financial stability. But in that context, monetary policy is subservient to not only fiscal policy, but what goes on the external sector side. And lastly, but most importantly, the implication of those two first things is that most of the adjustment has to happen on the fiscal side of things, which means that what goes on with expenditure and what goes on with taxes and so on is very, very important to how the economy functions. Because as we know, in the Caribbean and in Trinidad and Tobago as well, the government has a very large footprint in the domestic economy. I also want to make the point that, you know, as economists, we always talk about stable fiscal accounts, stable debt, productivity, efficiency, and so on. Roger mentioned the whole issue in the labor market and so on. But we often have to be reminded that, you know, these economic objectives are not ends in themselves. It is a means to an end. What use is it to have nice looking accounts in terms of the fiscal side, the balance of payment side, and you have pretty bad outcomes in terms of social welfare, political stability, and those kinds of things. So we always have to keep in mind when we're discussing economic policy that although there are some economic metrics that we need to pay close attention to, we always have to keep in mind, and at the center of our thought process is the fact that, you know, these things are really a means to an end, and that end really is to ensure that there's a certain minimum level of welfare and that people can aspire to higher and higher welfare as time goes on across generations and so on. Okay, so the broad strategy of the government, obviously, when it took office on the first occasion, was one of stabilization. I think without the COVID pandemic, the government would have been looking to transition more to the growth phase of the whole entire process of adjustment and so on. Unfortunately, the pandemic happened, and you now have to focus almost exclusively on responding to the pandemic in different ways, which means that most of the plans that you may have had before kind of goes out the window, at least until the worst parts of the pandemic is over. So all these things are contexts that we need to pay attention to, because although Roger mentioned some of the domestic structural features that drive the economic outcomes, some argue that the external environment is often more important than whatever we do here in Trinidad because of the small open nature of our economy, right? So in that context, I think there are some major issues that the government and the country has to consider. The first is that in the context of the international environment and in the context of the kind of structural problems that Dr. Hussein mentioned, there are some key things to mention, and most of the issues that we have to deal with is on the fiscal side. I personally think, and Roger kind of alluded to the situation, that we have reached a threshold in terms of government expenditure, if we were to cut further, that is going to significantly negatively affect not only short-term but long-term prospects in the economy. In a modern economy, you need to have a certain minimum threshold for government expenditure, and I think we have cut down to the bone, so to speak. And some may actually argue that in the context of the pandemic, the government may have tried to actually increase the amount of expenditure to try to boost up the economy, since private demand has basically collapsed during the period of the pandemic. Of course, that has to be done in the context of the fiscal space that we have, and as you know, we don't have a lot of we have much better fiscal space than many of our counterparts in the region, but we still are severely constrained in that area. So the first thing is that I think that government expenditure has reached the lowest level that is possible in the context of not harming growth in the medium to long term. So the implication of that, of course, is that in the context of the large fiscal deficit that we still have, is that most of the adjustment has to happen on the revenue side. Now, the minister spoke to some of those issues because he mentioned there's a lot of talk in the media about property tax and so on. And property tax, of course, is one of the major planks of revenue generation that the government has built its overall strategy on. Now, the problem with that is that we have to ask the question, is the expected increase in tax revenue from the full implementation of the property tax going to be sufficient? And the short answer, of course, is no, right? So in the context where we expect global economic activity not to improve as drastically as we anticipated, and by extension, the kinds of problems we have in the Caribbean and in Trinidad in particular to continue, you know that it is likely that we are going to face the prospect of increased taxes in other areas. And I would suggest that we should, if we have to adjust at all, we adjust on the income tax side rather than on the indirect taxes like VAT and so on, because direct taxes tend to be much more amenable to achieving your equity objectives and so on. So in the context of the kind of economic policy framework that we have, and in the context of the international and domestic challenges we face, we have to do most of the adjustment on the fiscal side, and in that, even in that subcategory, we have to do most of the adjustment on the revenue rather than on the expenditure side. So in that respect, if you notice that we have an overall expenditure of roughly 52 billion, and that I think is the minimum that the government should have done. And I think that in some cases you may actually have an argument could actually be made that it could be probably potentially higher in the context of the pandemic, right, as a response to that particular thing. There's also huge a huge issue with expenditure efficiency in this country. I mean to say, people looking at the financial press and so on in the country, there's many stories about potential wastages and so on in the government. And I have actually done some work on expenditure efficiency in the Caribbean, and it's probably dated now because that was in 2015. But what it showed is that while we have relatively good expenditure efficiency in analytical areas such as education, health, welfare, and those kinds of things, on the public sector investment program, we were way low on the expenditure efficiency relative to our peer, which suggests that there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of how we spend money, especially in terms of infrastructural development. It was shockingly low, right, relative to our peers. So although that is most likely to have improved over the last couple of years because expenditure efficiency tends to increase the lower the levels of government expenditure overall, but the level to which it had sunk in 2015 suggests to me that there's considerable improvement that could be made in those areas. So you don't have to increase the amount of output we could derive from a certain amount level of government expenditure if we were to try to improve expenditure efficiency, right? Because what that means is that for every dollar spent in the Pareto efficiency framework, for every dollar spent in the infrastructural thing, more than 50% was actually being spent inefficiently or wasted, right? So that means that we could make considerable savings in that arena, and we could also use the money to build out some of the deficiencies that we have in other areas, as Dr. Hosein mentioned, right? So the major implication is that most of the adjustment, as I said, have to have money revenue side, which implies more taxes. So property tax is very important, and the government, the minister actually signaled in his budget speech that the money is going to backstop the local authorities. So that was an important question that most people had vis-a-vis the property tax as to how it was going to use. Was it going to be used by the central government, or was it going to be backstop and finance local government, which is in an ideal world what it should do, right? So in that context, that is a very important development. And I'm happy that the minister actually clarified that particular position. In that context, if that is a major source of funding for local government, it will mean that it frees up a significant amount of finances from the central government side to be spent in other areas. So that is going to help us in a long way, right? Of course, this whole issue of taxation is a very challenging political economy issue. And as you know, governments are very, very, very unwilling to increase taxes because that has implications for their electability in the next election and so on. But given the problems that we face, the fact that we are the threshold in terms of government expenditure, the lower threshold, and the fact that the international economy and the regional economy in particular is unlikely to improve as much as we wanted to correct some of these imbalances, we will, in the medium term, I think, have to broach a very difficult issue of property tax. Not only property tax, but also the whole issue of higher income tax and so on. Another key question is how we finance the deficit, of course, because as the minister indicated, the deficit is about $9 billion. In the budget, he actually talked about that a little bit. So our options basically is whether we use foreign borrowing, domestic borrowing, more taxes, as I mentioned, which I think is one of the more sustainable ways to deal with it in the short term. Adjustment on the exchange rate side, because if you were to adjust the exchange rate, automatically the TT dollar receipts of the government goes up. But of course, the government have already established that their preference in terms of the policy mix is that they don't want to have much of the adjustment comes through the exchange rate side. So if in the present context, the present preference of the government is that you're unlikely to have that particular lever to use in the future. So therefore, you have to basically use either borrowing, more taxes, or sale of strategic assets, such as the one announced in the budget with the sale of FCB shares and so on. on that matter, on the sale of SB shares of oil, we also have to be careful about the implications that particular move has for concentration in the banking sector in a situation where the banking sector is already highly concentrated. Okay. A lot of the choices we make on how we finance the deficit is also going to have implications for the sustainability. And as we know, we have huge challenges in this area. So we have to think very carefully about those things going forward. So in terms of the specific elements in the budget, the government have kind of dealt in partly with some of these issues, so they have at least not cut expenditure any further. That's one. The government basically have to also increase revenues, and they have, if you look at the budget, the only area where there is going to be an increased revenue stream is in the property tax and on the property tax side, but they have also given some incentives to kind of boost the manufacturing and other sectors and so on. But when you look at the numbers, although in some areas the minister did not indicate specifically what the loss in tax revenue would entail, but it should not be more than between 100 to 200 million US dollars loss in tax revenue. Sorry, not US dollars, TT dollars loss in tax revenue. So that's not too much of a hit in the context of a revenue production that is $43 billion. Okay, so the point I'm making is that the overall measures on the tax side implies to me that once we come out of this pandemic, we would need to make adjustment on the income tax side in particular. In the short term as well, it is, although many people have criticized the government for its borrowing activities, what do you do? In the short term, unless you want to use up all the reserves, and you also interested in maintaining economic activity at a certain minimum level, you have to borrow. In the short term, you have to borrow. And my preference would be to borrow domestically rather than internationally, because borrowing internationally has a whole set of different risk factors that you probably wouldn't want to deal with in this time, right? So those are the tax measures, right? I talked about the property tax, increases income tax rather than VAT. The other revenue measures that could potentially have implications for the concentration in banking sector. And on the supply side, the government, as I mentioned before, I think was in the process of transitioning to focusing more on the supply side, having gone through a period where they were basically trying to stabilize the economy. And in this budget, they have tried to signal where they're going to go in terms of the tax incentive by trying to give a boost to different sectors and so on. But those particular measures, I think, are going to have at best a minimal impact on those particular sectors and so on. So we need to do things that are more significant. So those things that are more significant and would be things like the special economic zones that the minister mentioned, the infrastructural projects, very important going forward, which is in the construction sector, which, as you know, is a major sector driving the economy forward. In the short term, at least, those are going to be important. The $300 million for the agricultural stimulus plan, which is important in the context of not only employment generation, but also in the context of reducing our food import bill. I do not see the agriculture sector driving any particular huge swing in export revenues and so on. But at least on the import substitution front, especially in terms of food and so on, we could make a huge dent in the present huge import bills that we have, which has implications for the foreign exchange markets and so on. And last but by no means least is the low-hanging fruit in terms of boosting up the contribution of the tourism sector by the announced new construction of new hotels in Tobago, as well as the development of the Tobago airport and so on. But those things, of course, are going to impact, are going to come on stream in the medium term. So in the present, you really have to do things such as the infrastructural projects and so on to boost up economic activity. So in closing, the measures that the government put in place in the current budget really is an attempt to bring some support to vulnerable groups, try to boost up some of the contribution of the export sector. But the implication is that there is going to have to be a reckoning in terms of higher taxes on the revenue side. And hopefully the investments we make now in the agriculture, the tourism sector, and in the special economic zones are going to bear fruit in the next 3 to 5 years, so that we could begin to start to come out of the hole that the economy is in. So I will stop there, and I would welcome any questions that participants may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Seerattan. Another very insightful presentation. Let me turn it over now to our last panelist, Dr. Attzs, to share her views. Dr. Attzs, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Deonanan. And good morning to my colleagues from the Department of Economics and to the general audience. Had some technical challenges at the start, but I think we're all set now. I would have missed some of what Dr. Hosein would have presented, but I think I got enough of it to understand his take, and certainly Dr. Seerattan's presentation, looking more at the structural side and discussing some of the fiscal issues and the challenges that we face in terms of how do we navigate what I call a COVID-adjusted economy in the context of Budget 2022. And the budget was themed by the Minister of Finance, building resilience in the face of the global pandemic. So throughout my presentation, you will see my tagline about building resilience, because I think it is an important construct for us where we are now. We are in the throes of COVID-19. I don't know that we are seeing any light at the end of the tunnel just yet. So it means that we're going to have to deal with what I call a COVID-adjusted Trinidad and Tobago economy. And I also want to begin my presentation by quoting Arthur Lewis, one of our economists, Nobel laureate, who said that good economics begins with a concern for the conditions under which people live. And it is something that I've always held very true to in terms of how I view economic issues, particularly at this juncture in Trinidad and Tobago's time. Not going to go through too much of this anymore, because I know Roger and Dave would have spent some time discussing these issues. The structure of the economy is still heavily dependent on the energy sector. Persistent deficits, our national debt is increasing. We're depleting our reserves. We got a slight boost recently when we got the special drawing rights from the IMF. Some challenges continuing in terms of the ease of doing business. And I wanted to lay these as foundations for the conversation that I'm going to move into in a little while, in terms of how do we navigate this new space in which we find ourselves. Not going to spend time on that. This is not a secret, and I'm sure that Roger and Dave would have spoken to it. The fiscal deficits that we've been experiencing are not COVID-induced. They're exacerbated by COVID-19. But certainly from these data, we could see that we've had fiscal deficits for many years, certainly from this particular infographic from 2016. So we want to distinguish between what was happening before COVID-19 and the COVID-induced fiscal deficits. Not going to spend time on this, articulated by both speakers that the debt is increasing. Just thought I would add some flavor to it in terms of the conversation. We have an uphill battle in terms of the debt, the rising debt to GDP ratio that we're facing in Trinidad and Tobago. And it will have implications for how we move forward. Dave in his presentation spoke about, the possibility that we're going to have to look at gathering more revenue from perhaps increased taxes, but we don't want to put that boogeyman out there now before someone leaves with a soundbite from this seminar that says, we said that they're going to be increased taxes, but certainly we're going to have to address, we the people will have to address the increasing debt burden. And I keep saying we the people because the debt is being incurred now, but citizen John, Jane, all of us participating in this webinar today will ultimately have to pay the price, no pun intended, for those high debt to GDP ratios. Again, this graph shows that what we're experiencing now is not only as a result, it is exacerbated by COVID-19. These are the numbers of persons, according to the Ministry of Labor, for whom retrenchment notices were registered with the ministry from as far back as 2018, long before COVID became apparent. Of course, it was significantly, there was a significant spike in 2020, January to December 2020, because that is when all of the lockdown measures were put in place. COVID-19 came to roost in Trinidad and Tobago in a very serious way in March of 2020. So it's not surprising, but wanting us to pay attention to the fact that we have been having challenges on the employment front in Trinidad and Tobago long before COVID-19. So these are retrenchment notices, and the retrenchment notices are simply part of the conversation around unemployment in Trinidad and Tobago. This is not the only part of the picture. So we know when COVID-19 came, all of the lockdowns in terms of food and beverage sector, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we know that things are significantly different, notwithstanding the fact that the latest official data coming out of the CSO suggests that our unemployment rate is at 5.1%, but we suspect that things are significantly higher in that regard. Again, this is a snapshot alluded to by both Roger and Dave, but a snapshot. And the point I wanted to make, I heard Dave make mention of government revenues coming from collection of taxes, et cetera, et cetera. The IMF has estimated that Trinidad and Tobago has a tax gap of $8 billion. And I think one of the points I want to make now, and I will reiterate that point later on in the presentation, is that our challenge really is the institutional and regulatory frameworks to allow us to capture those revenues. So we have transitioned, and the conversation has been in the public space about the transition from the Board of Inland Revenue to the Revenue Authority. But for us to be able to tap into those revenues that have been VAT, PAYE, etc., all of those taxation revenues that have been lost, that have been leaking out of the system, you really need a robust institutional framework, which the Revenue Authority is being touted as being that more robust institutional framework that will allow us to realize greater revenues accruing and plugging those leakages in terms of taxation that government is not able to capture. So we wait to see that. Of course, the breakdown in terms of oil revenue, non-oil revenue, et cetera, but of course, adding to the deficit, a 5.8% of GDP anticipated. We know that last year, government had anticipated a fairly modest deficit, and COVID-19, things went awry, and that budget deficit doubled. So we were looking at a significantly higher budget deficit. So we see what pans out in budget year in fiscal 2022. I just want to touch on some of the points that were raised in the budget, and all in the context of providing some background to the whole question of building resilience, which, as I said, was the theme. So one of the areas highlighted in budget 22 was the role of small and medium enterprises. Not a new conversation from the government. Government has been talking about it. Successive governments have been talking about the role of small and medium enterprises as part of the diversification thrust in Trinidad and Tobago. We know that oil and gas, we're meant to be having conversations about energy transition. Some of those conversations came out in the reading of the budget on Monday, but certainly the role of SMEs as part of the diversification thrust has always been advocated by the current government and previous governments. But in this year's budget presentation, the minister spoke about SMEs involved in technology and providing them with tax breaks so that they can, for those SMEs that are involved in technology solutions, digitization, and construction, and for which their focus on these three areas is more than 50% of their annual revenues. He also spoke about a mentorship program for the SMEs, because when the Minister of Finance made his presentation, either on the mid-year review or in terms of one of his updates in terms of the support the ministry was providing for COVID-19, he spoke about the grants that had been made available to SMEs, but the fact that there had been very little uptake on that grant by the SMEs, because it simply did not have the capacity and the wherewithal to do some of the basic, and to satisfy some of the basic criteria in terms of submitting audited accounts, etc., And the minister was lamenting the fact that our SMEs needed support. So it is welcome to see that there is a mentorship program that has been articulated in Budget 2022 to provide support for these SMEs, and of course to allow these SMEs to be able to be listed on the Trinidad and Tobago Stock Exchange. And that is a continuation of a conversation that started in Budget 2022 when it was read, Budget 2021 when the budget was read last October. But I have a couple of questions. One of the things is that we talk about SMEs in Trinidad and Tobago as if they are homogeneous, that we know exactly what our SME sector looks like, that we have data on our SME sector, which is really not the case. And I mean, the first thing I want to say is that I think that we need to understand that I want to suggest that there should be a typology of SMEs in Trinidad and Tobago, starting with the nano enterprises, the 1 or 2 persons. And the juncture in our economic space now is where we find persons are becoming retrenched or opting to leave their jobs on some voluntary separation program and opting to go into business. So they may not satisfy what you're seeing in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, what the CSO's Register of Business Establishment defines as small and medium enterprises in Trinidad and Tobago, between 6 and 25 employees, an asset base of $250,000 to $1.5 million, and sales of between $250 million to $5 million. And then, of course, the medium enterprises having 26 to 50 employees, an asset base of 1.5 million, sales of 5 to 10 million, et cetera, et cetera. I think the time has come for us to depart a little bit from those traditional definitions of SMEs and look at what might actually be the case in Trinidad and Tobago. And I'm suggesting that there are opportunities for us to have nano, micro, small, medium enterprises in Trinidad and Tobago, and the architecture to support those different kinds of enterprises will be different. So think of it as it were in terms of a product life cycle. Depending on where you are, you would need a different kind of support in Trinidad and Tobago. And we also need to recognize that coming out of the lockdown measures, many of these small, medium enterprises or micro enterprises might actually have closed down because they were not able to survive the lockdown measures. So I think in terms of the incentives put in place in Budget 2022 for small and medium enterprises, there might be an opportunity or there might be a need for us to step back a bit and have a fuller appreciation for the typology of SMEs that we have in Trinidad and Tobago. Another measure that was mentioned in Budget 2022 was with respect to boosting foreign direct investment in Trinidad and Tobago. The government, I think, recognizes that it is no longer in a position to be all things to all persons, given, of course, its own revenue situation and, of course, the increasing debt. So it is now trying to set the stage for foreign direct investment to return to Trinidad and Tobago as part of the building resilience. The withholding tax rate has been reduced from 10 to 8%. And of course, the distribution made to parent companies, the rate is to be reduced from 5% to 3%. And of course, on the face of it, this is good. But I think I want us to kind of focus on 1 or 2 issues that I want to suggest. The ease of doing business remains a challenge in Trinidad and Tobago. So you have issues such as the bureaucracy in terms of getting things done, the bureaucracy and the efficiency, unclogging those arteries that are meant to provide administrative support to either local industries or foreign industries that want to invest in Trinidad and Tobago. We know that that has been a pain point for us in terms of the ease of doing business. We know that crime has been a pain point in terms of how we do business in Trinidad and Tobago. So while this measure by the government in terms of the reductions in the withholding tax rate might be seen as welcome, we have to unclog the arteries that are preventing us from realizing the efficiencies in terms of how businesses operate in Trinidad and Tobago. I mean, there is a statistic that talks about the length of time it takes to open an account, if you are to open an account in the banking sector, etc. And the minister spoke to that on Monday. But these are some of the issues I think we need to confront and we need to address, even as we talk about wanting to reignite foreign direct investment in Trinidad and Tobago, as it would. There is also, of course, the other question in terms of foreign direct investment. When profits are to be repatriated, access to foreign exchange, and that remains a challenge for us in Trinidad and Tobago for local businesses that want to have foreign exchange to facilitate the conduct of their business. So can you imagine if we invited all of these foreign companies to invest in Trinidad and Tobago and they had profits to repatriate? We will continue to have a foreign exchange challenge, notwithstanding the fact that we've been given the $644 million boost based on the SDRs that the IMF would have provided to us. Some mention in terms of that energy transition and reducing the carbon footprint for Trinidad and Tobago, always a welcome conversation, particularly when we know that globally, with the geopolitical winds of change going in a different direction. So you have the Biden-Harris administration in the United States that is very keen. They campaigned on renewable energy. President Biden has said that they want to increase renewable energy from, I think, a mere 4 or 5%, as it currently stands, at 45% in the United States by the year 2050. It means that the winds of change are shifting away from non-renewables, such as we are heavily dependent on in Trinidad and Tobago, to renewable energy. So the government of Trinidad and Tobago has not been lost in that conversation. And while we're still heavily dependent on oil and gas in terms of the non-renewable sector, some efforts made in budget 2022 to reduce our carbon footprint. So the conversation around electric vehicles, tax credits for carbon capture and enhanced oil recovery, etc. So some mention there, but of course, a question, particularly in terms of the electric vehicles, is whether or not we have adequate infrastructure in Trinidad and Tobago to realize the benefits from this. So we've lost all of the custom duties from these vehicles and the motor vehicle tax and VAT, etc. But do we have the infrastructure in place to make the importation of electric vehicles a worthwhile investment for persons who may want to reduce their personal carbon footprints? Support for low income families, much conversations taking place since Monday on the additional zero rated items. The Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance ended his presentation on Monday on a high, talking about biscuits and cooking oil, etc., and pigtail. And of course, for those who might have been following this conversation, back in September, these same items were headline items because their prices and the cost of these items had increased sometimes 75 to 100 to more than 100%. And of course, the conversation at that time was that for many persons on the lower echelon of the income scale, these were staples in their food basket, so to speak. So it meant that for those persons, a daily meal had become significantly more expensive than it had been. So I think for many persons, it's a welcome change that the minister has, but I think there's been some conversation between Monday and certainly yesterday with the Supermarket Association in terms of how what adjustments actually are going to be made. But certainly the conversation around providing support for low-income families and essentially reversing the price increases that would have been seen in these particular items in September, I think that was welcome. Of course, the conversation around the 25% rebate on TNTech bills for residential customers, where those bills are $300 or less, that rebate now being increased to 35%. Of course, and Dave made the point that for all of these measures that the government has put in place, there is income, there is revenue that is foregone. And in this particular case, the issue of the rebate being increased from 25 to 35%, the government has indicated that it's about $25 million in revenue foregone. And if and when the rates are actually increased for both electricity and water, the persons who will benefit, the households that will benefit from these measures the government has put in place will in fact be receiving some kind of electricity card and water card to ensure that, or to try to minimize any corruption that will take place, but to ensure that the benefit accrues to the persons who actually need it. So I want to move away from that conversation in terms of some of those specific measures to try and segue and to locate that conversation in the context of these things called the Sustainable Development Goals. Trinidad and Tobago and many other countries in the world signed on to these SDGs, which are 17 goals with significant amounts, more than 100 targets that we're meant to achieve by the year 2030, literally around the corner. And of course, this conversation around the SDGs started long before COVID-19. So I would imagine that now that there is some tweaking of the targets, because the COVID-19 has taken the world by storm, so many countries are going to be compromised in terms of their ability to meet these SDGs, and particularly small island developing states such as Trinidad and Tobago, where we have a myriad of other challenges, including the shortfalls in revenues that we're seeing because of what is happening in the energy sector. So I want to essentially segue or link the earlier part of my presentation to a conversation now around the SDGs and what Budget 22 might mean at this point in time for our achievement of the SDGs. So let's look at the first SDG, which talks about no poverty, poverty eradication. And I want to borrow this graph from the IDB. The IDB, in engaging a number of stakeholders in Trinidad and Tobago in a conversation around its strategy, its country strategy for Trinidad and Tobago, shared this diagram, shared this graph a couple of weeks ago. And I took it wholesale from the IDB with permission, of course. And it's titled, "Despite a generous welfare state, poverty is higher than expected for Trinidad and Tobago, given our per capita GDP." So our per capita GDP at purchasing power parity is just over $30,000, but our poverty rates are in excess of 20%. So I wanted to put that there, because if we're to talk about the first SDG, which talks about no poverty, it means that we need to have data. We need to understand who are the poor in Trinidad and Tobago, so that those transfers and subsidies, whether it's the fuel card or the water card or the electricity card, so that those transfers and subsidies that are meant to target the most vulnerable in our population are appropriately directed. But we need to have the data. I said, well, there has been traditionally a lot of conversation around what is the correct rate of poverty, number of poor people, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think those conversations are helpful. We really need to put a handle on the number of poor persons we have in Trinidad and Tobago, so that when we make interventions, they're directed and they're targeted. If we look at the second SDG, and I'm not going to go through all of them, I'm just going to highlight a few of them, zero hunger. Again, an interesting conversation coming out of Budget 2022. This was the headline on the Trinidad Guardian yesterday, that the government is admitting, the Minister of Finance is saying that the government cannot control food sector and that prices are out of the government's hands. Now, if that is the case, then it means, given the trajectory, and I want to refer to the central bank's economic bulletin that came out in July 2021, that spoke about food inflation that moved from 3.2% year on year to 5.1% as of June of 2021. And it says, the central bank also says in that report that inflationary pressures are expected to remain contained, but could gather steam depending on global price developments, especially in relation to food prices. So contemplate for a moment a conversation around rising food prices, notwithstanding whether they are zero rated or they have the full VAT on the food prices. A conversation around rising food prices, a conversation around cost of living in Trinidad and Tobago, a conversation around increasing unemployment, a conversation around minimum wages, and a conversation around outstanding wage negotiations, which the Minister of Finance said will resume in short order between the CPO and the relevant unions. Contemplate those intersecting conversations for a moment, and it would seem that achieving this SDG of zero hunger is not likely to be something that Trinidad and Tobago can achieve anytime soon if those prices continue to spiral out of control. And of course, the reason being given for the food prices, of course, because we consume things that we do not produce, and we produce things that we do not consume. So the fact that we are importing all of the food that we're consuming, or most of the food, means that we're also importing them at higher prices. And then you add to that the shortage of foreign exchange and the prices that you have to pay for foreign exchange, et cetera, to pay for these things. And I was in a conversation with the president of the Supermarkets Association 2 days ago, and he was talking about the cost of shipping a container of food or anything else, any kind of container, has moved from $3,000 in some cases to $10,000, $15,000 per container. So those prices will, of course, inevitably be passed on. But of course, there is an opportunity. There is an opportunity for us in having a conversation around food prices to have a meaningful conversation about the agriculture sector, not simply in terms of how the agriculture sector contributes to employment, but also how it contributes to food and nutrition security for people in Trinidad and Tobago. So that brings me to SDG number 3, where we talk about health. We know the Ministry of Health has been grappling with COVID-19 issues, but our economic space and economic recovery, even in a COVID-adjusted environment, is dependent on conversations around vaccinations. So according to the Minister of Finance, we have less than 40% of our population fully vaccinated as at Monday when he was speaking. So we know that the Ministry of Health might be challenged given where we are, and these are not disparate conversations. These conversations are integrated to my mind, because when you talk about importing processed food, you're also talking about health and well-being. So there is an opportunity for us to have very holistic conversations moving forward. SDG number 4, talking about quality education. No mention of education in the budget on Monday, except to talk about the allocation to the Ministry of Education. I expect, however, that the Minister of Education is going to have a lot to say when she does in fact contribute to the budget debate that starts tomorrow. But we know that education has been a challenge for many persons, many of our young people in Trinidad and Tobago, from the early childhood sphere to primary to secondary and even to the tertiary levels, because you had issues of connectivity, having devices, having to navigate that space, having to transition from face-to-face to online, and not all children are created equally, so that we know that some may have had more challenges than others. Trinidad and Tobago is not alone in this regard, but I think it is important for us to have a conversation on how we're going to deal with what might well be a significant education deficit facing many of our children. SDG number 6, clean water and sanitation. Potable water continues to be a challenge for many in Trinidad and Tobago. And I have to say that every time I hear a conversation around the protocols, the 3 W's, wash your hands, I cringe, because I think of the number of people who are not able to wash their hands with the frequency as is recommended because they have no access to potable water. So water is a scarce commodity for them in Trinidad and Tobago. Jumping now, some mention about SDG 7 and 13 in terms of the reducing of the carbon footprint for Trinidad and Tobago. SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. Some mention about issues that are meant to help us propel economic growth, digitization, for example, tourism in Tobago. But I would want to suggest that digitization is a vehicle that could help us achieve economic growth, that can help us navigate a space moving forward to help us realize economic growth. But there is still much groundwork to be done in that particular area, and particularly building the architecture around the digital landscape in Trinidad and Tobago. There is a need for public education. There is a need for education in our schools so that we have the human capital to support a digitization thrust. So much work still needs to be done in terms of that digital conversation. Again, SDG 7 and 13, as I said, some mentioned there in terms of reducing our footprint. SDG 10, reduce inequalities. Still looking for some data. We always make the point, certainly the economists on this panel always make the point about the paucity of data in Trinidad and Tobago, so that we're not clear what we're measuring. So there is need for us to have data, particularly data on our Gini coefficients, to see what our inequalities look like in Trinidad and Tobago, and again, to help guide policy formulation as to how we can correct those imbalances. And I just want to jump, in the interest of time, to SDG 16, strong institutions focusing on that. The IDB some time ago put out a publication that talks about economic institutions for resilient Caribbean, and I think that remains true for Trinidad and Tobago. A lot of what was articulated in Budget 2022 is predicated on having strong institutional and regulatory frameworks to allow us to achieve some of those. Certainly things like revenue collection, certainly the growth of SMEs in Trinidad and Tobago, and some of the other measures that have been identified rely very heavily on robust institutional frameworks to help us achieve those particular goals and objectives. So I would want to see some efforts being made in that regard to allow us to move forward. So my final word is to thank the department again for hosting this seminar today on the post-budget 2022 conversation and for inviting me to participate in the conversation. And I look forward to the question and answer period so that we can shed some light and have some further engagement in terms of these issues. So thanks again for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Attzs. That graph is very telling. We have to talk a bit more in terms of income levels and poverty. Very interesting presentations. Let me just take a moment to recap. I know we've been through quite a while through various presentations. We had Dr. Hussein, who talked about the big picture, the structure of the Trinidad and Tobago economy, and the need to realign the structural reforms that are needed, hinting at structural reforms needed to realign for growth. We had Dr. Seerattan, who focused on the context and the environment around this setting the budget. He looked at suggestions on managing the fiscal space and interpreted the budget from that sense, managing the fiscal space, the implications of specific measures, how those might impact the economy in the short term. And then we had Dr. Attzs most recently here with her hashtag building resilience, and she interpreted specific measures within the budget under that context of building resilience and provided some context of that against the sustainable development goals. So we have had a number of different perspectives, wide perspectives, experts within these specific fields, but they all come together because, again, a budget is a developmental tool that we articulate on a yearly basis. And while it is that many times we think about, when people talk about the budget, we say, well, what's happening with prices? Are prices going to increase or decrease? Am I going to pay more taxes? What's happening? But I hope that what you hear coming out of the panel today from our experts is that it is more than just whether prices or taxes are going to increase or decrease, but it is about achieving a development goal. And it has been in that context that the interpretation and the insights have been articulated. I'm going to turn to, we have had an active audience, and we are grateful that you all are joining us and that you continue to be there with us, active in terms of the questions. And we're going to turn to those questions that have been posed to the panel. So let me get straight to them. Now, these questions have been posed to specific people, but certainly the commentary need not be only from that person as well. So I'll mention who it is posed to, but I open it to the entire panel post the specific person that it has been asked. So I have here Joshua asking of Dr. Hussein, do you think the incentivized digitization policies would help to improve the labor participation rate and create export of more services? So digitization, would those policies help to improve the labor participation rate and create more export of these services? Let me start with Dr. Hussein, and certainly if anybody else afterwards wants to weigh in, you're welcome. Dr. Hussein.
Sorry, Regan, thanks. Do you want me to answer now, or give you the time? Do you want us to take questions in batches of 3?
Let me take one question at a time, given what I have here.
Okay, so yes, it will improve the labor force participation rate. I hope, because some people, they could work from home, they may have had restrictions in terms of participating in the labor market because of distance, because of family commitment, so it could possibly help in that regard. And in terms of service exports, yes, again, one of these people who comes into the labor market might have a skill or something to offer online that was not being offered before. So possibly, yes, it could help in that regard. I would like to counter in terms, though, with a question linked to that to Dave. I noticed, and it's the only time of the year I get to speak to him, so I use the opportunity when it comes up. I was a little surprised to see the call for the prospective call for an increase in income tax in the context of the food prices that Marlene mentioned. The food prices that we see announced by central bank and whatnot. So if Dave could elaborate some more as to why he thinks the adjustment should come from via possibly increasing, and I think he said possibly increasing income taxes rather than cutting expenditures. And the second part linked to that is that, you know, there is this talk about quality of life and standard of living, and I take that and I get all that. But as we speak, trying to preserve transfers and subsidies at around 20 billion has led in the last 5 years debt per capita GDP to move from 5,000 US to about 10,000 US per capita. And that would obviously affect our lives in many different ways. So here it is, we are trying to talk about Pareto optimality and keeping transfers and subsidies at a certain level at a tremendous cost to the economy. To me, it comes at the cost of crowding out some degree of capital expenditure by the state, whilst at the same point in time, it's almost as if we are turning a blind eye to what is going on with debt per capita and the other implications of that nature. Now, unless I misread the comment about Dave with income, I would like if he could, when my turn comes or when it's appropriate according to Regan, if he could respond to that, please. Thanks.
Sure. Dr. Hussein, thanks for the insight there. Let me hold off on your question just for a second to come back to the question from Joshua about the incentivized digitization. So we'll come to it, but specifically on the question of incentivized digitization of those policies and whether that has the ability, the capacity to create more export of services. Dave, Dr. Seerattan, Dr. Attzs, any views, would you all like to take, you have any views on this?
If I could just jump in for a second.
Yes,
and I think I agree with Roger that there is an opportunity for people to work from home and all of these things so that, you know, yes, life can continue and we can have productivity. But I think that there is a missing infrastructure to be put in place. So you think about, I don't know if anyone has tried to conduct business with the public sector between last year and this year, and it's a little short of a nightmare because for many of those systems, while for us at UWI, many of us at UWI, we can easily transition into digital space. For the public service, there still continues to be files. So a file needs to move from here to there. And even though people are working online, they still need to get the file from somewhere. So I think while there is an opportunity for digital services and for there to be efficiencies to be realized, I think some of the architecture, both in terms of the hardware, the infrastructure to be put in place, but also the software from the people side and the human capital side, I think some of those things still need to be connected and to be finessed for the full potential of the digitization to be realized as we move forward. And that's why in my presentation, I spoke about the architecture around it. So saying that we're going to digitize and saying that we're going to have more efficient services, I don't think will be immediately realized until we bring together the hardware and the software, which is also the people side of things, and ensuring that we have the necessary upskilling that might be required to allow for it to be as efficient as it can be.
Sure.
Yeah, if I could also contribute as well, Regan. I think I agree with Marlene in terms of the facilities that needs to be put in place, but also the culture. So, for example, this whole much touted working from home arrangement to me has not worked at all, because working from home implies that you have email and phone contact with people who you may want to contact, but that is not the case. So, for example, a lot of people have reached out to me recently, students and so on, complaining bitterly about trying to contact officials at UE to solve one problem or another. And that contact is just not there, either because the infrastructure is not in place, the protocols in terms of who pays for these costs are not in place, or because simply people just don't have a culture of answering their phone when they're working from home. So these are issues and cultural issues that we have to deal with. And there is going to be, I think, a huge drop in productivity during the period of pandemic, which might last in the post-pandemic period because people have gotten accustomed to staying home and so on and so forth. And let's face it, when you're home, if you're a parent, you know, you can't really devote the 8 hours a day that you need to satisfy your professional duties. So I think this much touted improvement or beneficial effect of working from home is something that we need to think more carefully about.
As I have you there, Dr. Seerattan, we have a question from Zainab. What are the problems that could arise if the government decided to invest most of the profit gained from the energy sector into other sectors like tourism, instead of back into the energy sector as a way of moving away from dependence on the energy sector? So let me turn it to you, this question specifically to you, but certainly other members can weigh in.
Well, in an ideal world, that is what we should have been doing, because everybody recognized that our economy is relatively undiversified, and the fact that our country is undiversified opens up us to the negative impacts of shocks from the energy sector, as has happened very recently and has happened in the past. So we benefit on the upswing, but we also suffer on the downswing. So recognizing that our economy is very centralized and dependent on the energy sector, the government, any government as a matter of fact, should have been strategically trying to wean us off those things and create different streams of export revenues to sustain us in the future. Now this is even more of an important issue, because as we know, many estimates of where the energy sector is going to go says that peak demand for oil and gas and is going to peak in 2025, if my memory serves me correct. So even in the best of worlds and so on, you know, you need to begin planning now to transition or reduce your dependence on the energy sector. So this pandemic is a useful opportunity to begin doing work in that area. So in terms of the fallout from that approach, I don't think there is any negative externalities other than sometimes when we make attempts to boost up different sectors, we throw money at those things, and those expenditures tend to be inefficient, and we tend to create relatively inefficient sectors going forward, because they basically did not have to fight their way through international competition and so on. So that's one of the potential negative impact of trying to boost up or promote or incentivize other sectors apart from the dominant energy sector.
Other panelists, should we be investing profits from the energy sector into other sectors? Potential risks.
Marlene, are you going to go? I have to let you go first if you are going.
No, you go ahead, Roger, you go. But one quick, I just say one, go ahead, Roger.
We tried this strategy in the 1970s and it worked well. We invested, and it makes good sense to invest the energy revenues into reproducible capital that could generate a sustainable stream of export revenues. In fact, that's exactly what we should be doing. What we instead undertook in Trinidad and Tobago economy, and I showed a graph, is somehow, and I have 3 young children, 2 are in university, 1 is in Form 5. And words can't describe how flabbergasted I get when I see that every single cent of the energy revenues was spent on one single line item, transfers and subsidies. And I showed you all a graph earlier. Yes, you could change up the language and say, well, it didn't work out that way and it didn't. Look at the data. That's all I will say. Look at the data. And in the process, for good measure, we have $130 billion in debt. Maybe after this budget, it could even be about 135, 138. So it's very late in the game, Regan, and whoever asked the question to be talking about this. Having said that, we can't change yesterday, we can influence tomorrow. So it's one out of 2 things. Either we take the new energy revenues and create the infrastructural enabling base. Marlene spoke about the ease of doing business, fix it. Yes, the World Bank and China may have been in a love affair and whatnot, we take that. But we assume from 2010 to 2019, the data was reasonably correct. Take the top 10 developing countries in the world, take their top 10 interventions that made those top 10 developing countries in the world be part of the top 100. So you have 100 data points here now, and from that select 20 that we have not implemented as yet, Regan, that could change the ease of doing business criteria in Trinidad and Tobago. So if you spend the money there and you open up economic space and you enable export revenues, that's one avenue. Or the second thing, and this has been my argument pre-COVID, I get really upset when people try to say all the economic problem from 2000 to 2021 is because of COVID. We have an opportunity now when the pandemic is finished, let's say by the end of next year, and all these comments are based on the assumption, Marlene, that people take the vaccine. Well, we have an option now, either to invest it in reproducible capital, as I mentioned, or put it in the HSF, which is very, very, very small. I also get upset when people say that we have $7 billion in the HSF. That is good, but it is such a small fraction of what we should have. And use the investment income there, the funds seem to be well managed, to help create more reproducible capital. So the fund grows, we have a stronger buffer in the future, given the sunset clause that Dave mentioned about 2025. I think it's 2030, Dave, but let's say it's 2027. Given the sunset clause, so that we can create long-term sustainable change. In the context of the revenues we generated, we are not in the positions we should be in, and therefore we need to structurally change things.
Well, you see, I always tell people, Roger and I mean, there are a few of us who are some of the original long time. We have now become the oldest people.
Dave is one too, Dave taught me,
we might come at it from different perspectives, but Roger ended just as how I was going to start. What is really required is a conversation and a commitment to structural adjustment. And I don't mean the structural adjustment where the Minister of Finance on Monday, he spoke about it. And of course, he pulled out the IMF boogeyman of the structural adjustment of years gone. And that is not what I mean. I mean that culturally, we have to realize that we have to transition away from traditional sources. The rest of the world is going into green economy. Those Paris meetings that are being held, the protests in London, the fact that Joe Biden, the fact that China, all of these countries are moving in a different direction. And we are still having conversations that talk about revenues are predicated on $65 a barrel and 3.75. I am not saying that that is not our reality. That is our reality, but we need to infuse in the conversation different threads. And until we do that, we will continue to have these conversations about essentially the whodunit conversations about what the HSF should have looked like. And of course, inside of that HSF conversation is a conversation that the Economic Development Board has very clearly articulated to the government that we need to separate out the heritage part from the stabilization part, because as it stands now, $7 billion later, that is available to the government to address any kind of disequilibriums in the economic space. So that's the first point I want to make. Well, the first 2 points, structural adjustment and HSF, we really have to make a concerted effort. If never before, certainly COVID-19 showed our vulnerabilities, and I think now is an appropriate time, but budget has been read, so we know we're not going in that direction. And the third thing I want to say is that we're talking about a post-COVID, and I don't know that we could talk about a post-COVID because there is the issue of the vaccine hesitancy on the one hand, and which is why I like to frame it as a COVID-adjusted way forward, because I think we have Delta, we have Mu, we don't know what else it have where, but certainly our regression was so significant in different ways that I think for us to kind of get beyond that, it is going to be beyond next year. It's not going to be a 2022 or 2023 story. I think so. We have to buckle in and start to contemplate what a COVID-adjusted reality would look like, whether it's the work from home reality, whether it's our economic space, whether it's our education, whether the digitization is going to allow us to kind of navigate the space differently. I mean, and just one anecdote on the digitization, I was trying to do a transaction online with a fairly large non-bank financial institution a couple of weeks ago. And I went and I filled in the form and everything. And then when I thought, okay, transaction will go through, they said to me, okay, completed it successfully. Please print it now and take it to the nearest branch of our organization. And that said to me that we really are not ready to embrace what digitization can bring to our economic space.
We have a question from Jamelia here, and I know Dr. Attzs raised this, the gap in terms of income collection from taxes. The question on targeting the revenue side, one of the big issues is a tax base and how many people, businesses are not included formally. Do you have any thoughts on how more people, businesses can be brought into the tax base, bearing in mind, and this is, I think, the really important part of the question, bearing in mind the political economy and administrative constraints of Trinidad and Tobago? The question is originally to Dr. Seerattan, but I know Dr. Attzs spoke of it. So if you wish, Dr. Attzs.
I can start, and Dave and Roger can jump in. I think the question was answered in a sense. I think what we're seeing is that we have the institutional failure. So the argument for the justification for the Revenue Authority is the inefficiency and institutional failure of the BIR to essentially capture people in that net. So you have all of these leakages. So we swung the pendulum away from the BIR to the Revenue Authority. But there are still institutional failings, coupled with the fact that we have a large informal sector. So one of the things that we could have done as a COVID-19 measure to essentially try to get some of the informal people, you register, we engage in some conversation about payment of taxes, for example, in order for you to be given a license to operate, even when we were locking down. So you incentivize the process while helping you address a pain point in terms of the number of people who fall outside of the net, so to speak. So it is not going to be an easy task. Again, it is a cultural issue that we face in Trinidad and Tobago. So the challenge really is how to not pay taxes as opposed to how to get yourself formalized, because becoming formalized with the BIR also has its own challenges. I mean, that is one of the inefficiencies that the Revenue Authority is meant to be addressing. But I think that part of the COVID-19 conversation could have allowed for some incentivizing, as it were, for some of these people in the informal sector who are not currently paying, whether it's taxes or making contributions to the national insurance scheme. Incentivize them by saying, if you were to register, we will essentially give you some kind of special consideration to operate your business or to reopen your business. So it is going to be a tricky situation moving forward now, because it has become commonplace to try to escape paying taxes. And I don't know whether or not a new entity, a new regulatory framework or a new institutional framework in the form of the Revenue Authority is actually going to help us close those gaps. But that's my initial contribution to that particular question.
Yeah, on the issue of taxes, I mentioned the government will have to look to increase taxes to make up the difference and to try to close the deficit the large deficit that we have. But in the context of the discussion on the Revenue Authority, I mean to say, a lot of people say that this is the doing of the present government. But if one was to look at some Article 4 consultations in previous years, this is something that came out of the discussion with the International Monetary Fund and so on, in the context of the recognition that our tax system is not very efficient. So in Trinidad and Tobago, the tax buoyancy, which is a measure of how tax revenue respond to increases in economic activity, is not very high, right? And that says there's something wrong fundamentally with the tax system. Now, when you're talking about tax system, right, it means that is the institutional structure in place for collection of taxes, as well as the individual matrix of different individual taxes, the amounts and so on and so forth, the exemptions and so on. That's the tax system. The last time we had fundamental tax reform was in the early 1990s. I think it kind of ended in, it lasted for about 5 years, ended in 1995, right? So that is a long time ago. And the efficiency of a tax system really only comes to the fore during a crisis, because during good times, when energy revenues are flowing and so on, it's fine. You could have an efficient tax system, but it really pays for its way during crisis period. And we have gone through a very difficult period ever since 2009, right? So in the context of that, what you need is not only the improvement in the administrative structure for tax collection, which is the Revenue Authority. And I agree completely with the present government that you have to enhance, upgrade the administrative structure for collecting taxes, but also you need to stay in the structure, the mix, the dynamic of the individual taxes, the mix between indirect and direct taxes, the mix, the amount that should come from the energy sector relative to the non-energy sector. All those kind of metrics needs to be carefully thought out in the context of the economic objectives we have in terms of revenue sufficiency, as well as economic efficiency and equity, right? And that only, the last time we did something like that was in the early 1990s, which means we are long overdue for a similar process. And simply changing up piecemeal different components of the tax system, and in this case, we're looking to change the administrative and institutional component of the tax system is not sufficient. We need to undergo a significant reform of our tax system to think carefully about the difference between the rates in the different sectors, the difference between indirect and direct taxes, as well as the institutional tax system for collecting revenues. And to me, the best approach in developing countries is really to have a very, very simple tax system with clearly identifiable rates for different sectors, with a minimum of exemptions, and so that you could devote the majority of your human resource in terms of enforcement and the collection of taxes, right? And when you have all these different exemptions and the tax system is complex and so on, it makes the job of the tax auditors and so on 10 times more difficult. So it is a very a simple strategy you have to institute in terms of tax reform, I think, in Trinidad and Tobago, and we need to do that. Now, on the question that someone asked in terms of the mix between direct and indirect taxes, and I think Roger raised that point as well. Direct taxes account for over 60% of the tax revenues in Trinidad and Tobago. So if you want to increase your tax revenue in the short term, obviously, you don't want to go and tinker with things at the margin, right? You want to tinker with the big ticket items that are going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. So that is direct taxes, which is income taxes for individuals and companies. Now, the advantage of focusing on direct taxes as well is that they also not only generate a large amount of revenues from your particular changes, but it also is better suited for achieving equity objective. Because if you use income tax, you could prorate the tax and the tax rate according to income level. So it's a ready-made mechanism for dealing with equity issues, which a lot of people are concerned about. So for example, obviously people who are unemployed, not collecting income and would not be paying income tax. So you don't want to go and increase VAT, because VAT is a tax that you have to pay whether you're employed or not, right? And in the context where we have to increase revenues because we recognize that we have reached a lower threshold of expenditure level, and therefore to close the deficit, we have to increase revenues, the best option really is direct taxes. And we need to be weaned off relatively low direct taxes, because we have gotten away with it because the incomes from the energy sector allowed us to maintain those low direct taxes. But the reality is, in the context of what is going on with the global energy industry, is that the future is that we are going to have to pay our way in a more meaningful way. And therefore, in that respect, you could expect direct taxes to take more of the burden relative to the energy taxes. And in that, you also need to undergo fundamental tax reform to ensure that your economic objectives of efficiency, equity, and revenue sufficiency is aligned with the parameters of the tax system.
All right. There are two more questions I want to get through within time that we have.
I wanted to comment on the tax thing as well. Do you have the time to allow me to comment?
Yes, Dr. Hosein, shortly. Go ahead.
You see, I feel as if they've made a contradictory comment there. On the one hand, prices has increased so that real wages, if you look at real wages, it has fallen. Yet still you are suggesting that we could increase direct income tax so that your real wage would fall even further. No problem, I take that we all have to adjust. But then at the same point in time, transfers and subsidies as a percent of capital expenditure is 700%. And in the past it was 400% and 300%. And you are saying that there is no room for adjustment on the government expenditure side. I think if we are going to, so whilst I could understand in the context of an economy that needs to make changes, that you need to come and modify direct taxes because it hasn't been changed, and you mentioned, I think, 1990 or some time period like that, 25 years, let's say. At the same point in time, you can't have transfers and subsidies in 2007 being 8 billion less than it is today, although in 2007 and 2021, you have the same income level. So we have we were promised a World Bank, I don't know if Marlene can remember, a World Bank rationalization of transfers and subsidies that would tell us where to cut. That has been promised about 4 or 5 years in succession in the budget. I am saying that when I look at the numbers, although without evidence, whilst I can agree with you that somewhere between 45 billion and 52 billion represents a lower bound threshold of government expenditure, I am saying to you that in my observation of the numbers, there is room for about 7 to 8 billion adjustment in transfers and subsidies. And this is the third time I'm using the word flabbergasted, because I look at these numbers as much as Marlene, we probably met this week as if we are going on dates all the time. And the adjustment is not being made. And although that adjustment is not being made, to come and say to people whose real wages are falling that, yes, now it's time to take an increase in direct taxes, whilst I could still logically where you are coming from, I must tell you as an economist, saying only half the sentence leaves me a little concerned.
Okay, just to respond to Roger, you remember when I was talking about the whole, Chair, if you could allow me a few seconds. Yeah, just when I was discussing the whole fiscal challenge that we face, I mentioned the whole issue of expenditure efficiency. And so I agree completely with Roger that the structure of our expenditure has to change. And in particular, the amount of money we spend on subsidy and transfer has to be adjusted, right? So that is not inconsistent with the need to change things on the revenue side, right? And just remember that the revenue side and the expenditure side are not mutually exclusive. So government could intervene on the expenditure side as well in terms of how it structures the expenditure side. So for those people whose real incomes has fallen on the expenditure side, if you could transfer some of those things out of subsidies and transfer and put it in areas that could boost up the incomes in particular ways, then that will work, right? But what I'm saying is you have to be able to run on 2 feet and sometimes 3 feet. So you need to be doing the changes on the expenditure side in terms of increasing expenditure efficiency and looking at the different allocations and where you need to adjust and so on. But you also need to be doing things on the revenue side. And further, what I'm saying is that in terms of the pressures, the real pressing dilemma now is on the revenue side. According to one of my colleagues in the past, he's an IT person, he said, Dave, if you don't have any money, you can't do anything. You understand?
You're not trying to answer Jamilia's question. We have a really nice question here, and I think you all in different ways would have alluded to it, and certainly Dr. Attzs. Sustainable Development Goal number 8. The recent pandemic has shed light on the precarious nature of work and the labor force and issues related to national insurance contributions, lack of protection of some workers. Do you think Budget 2022 address these issues in a meaningful way, and what more would you like to see? Dr. Attzs, now this question was posed to Dr. Attzs, and then we'll open to other members.
Thanks for that. Before I get into that, I just wanted to finish off my 2 cents, well, less than 2 cents on the issue of the expenditure. And because I think the conversation in terms of striking the balance is even more relevant when you hear the Minister of Finance suggest that he wanted to have a balanced budget by 2024. So he has to, and Dave has introduced something which I know will come out as one of the sound bites from today, but I think people need to understand that we are in very precarious places, because having said in the budget that you want to have a balanced budget by 2024, which I don't see happening unless something very radical takes place, and radical to the tune of what Dave alluded to, which I think will be radical. But something radical has to take place because 2024 is like next weekend. 2024 is just down the road. But anyway, let me go into answer Jamila's question. I don't think issues of lack of protection for workers and workers' rights, I don't think they were addressed in the budget, but it is still early days yet. What would have happened on Monday would have been the headlines to the budget, and absolutely nothing was said in terms of those issues. If there is an opportunity to revisit this question or this conversation, once the Minister of Labour makes his contribution, I think that is when we'll get a better sense, because one of my critiques of Monday's budget reading is that, as far as I can recall, this was probably the first time that we got so many headlines as opposed to some of the details. So it's a budget where nothing was said about Petrotrin, which is a major elephant in the room, and some of the other major things that we've spoken about in the past. Nothing was said on those things, and the minister did say that the respective line ministers will, in their contributions, speak to the details. But I do think issues of workers' rights and workers' security, if you were to align them with the SCG on decent work, I think that continues to be a challenge. And that became even more apparent when we had to engage in the lockdown measures. So if somebody was not an employee, a formal employee in the sense that you weren't making NIS contributions, it made it even easier to just let that person go, to change that person's terms of engagement or terms of employment. So I think the whole question of workers' rights are issues that we really need to address in Trinidad and Tobago, but I would not want to preempt or hazard a guess about what the Minister of Labour is going to say. So the devil in this budget really will come out in the details when the budget debate starts tomorrow in the House, and then of course in the Senate, as the case might be, but absolutely nothing was said. So I think we are all in the dark, Jamila, to see whether or not anything is going to be said to address some of those concerns from the workers' perspectives. And certainly the unions have been, not touching on some of those issues, but I think not in a very holistic way. So we will eventually get to those conversations in time to come, hopefully. All right, but we can revisit the question later on, and we can always remain in contact via email as the case might be.
Yeah, Dr. Hussein, Dr. Seerattan, any views? Quick, and the precarious nature of work, what else has the budget addressed this, and what else would you wish to see in that context?
Well, I think we have been discussing the whole issue of unemployment insurance for a very long time. The proposal that I remember seeing in the late 90s funded on the negotiations with the union and so on. But I think in the context where unemployment is supposed to be 5.1%, this is probably a moment when we should look to craft those issues, because going forward, given the advances in technology and so on, which is going to mean that we become much more automated, which has a direct bearing on the share of output going to labor is going to diminish over time. And therefore, we have to start devising more innovative mechanisms to ensure that people who are unemployed have some level of support. But not only that, we may even have to get to the point in the future where we need to discuss about a basic minimum income for everyone, because of the sea change in work and how people work and how workers participate in the future economy and so on. And so that is something that is probably a discussion we need to start now. But given the pressures that the minister faces, I think that is something that has to be put off for another discussion. But we always have to keep at the front of our minds when we talk about policy and policy response to economic challenges and so on, the end that we are seeking. And the end is the better welfare for citizens in Trinidad and Tobago. And at that response, we have to be much more explicit in how we treat with the working class and how we treat with workers and their terms and conditions of employment and those kinds of things. And I think sometimes, you know, these issues get lost in the battle to deal with big ticket issues. But at the end of the day, this is the single most important objective that we should have, which is better welfare for everybody in Trinidad and Tobago.
Dr. Hussein, any views there?
If I may just add to that very quickly, I agree with Marlene. Not much. I mean, I did a search for the word unemployment in the budget, as I said, and only one thing came up: unemployment relief program. So that should say a lot. What I would say is, and this is my final comment, Regan, I have to go after this. So thank you very much for the invitation. It's good to be this. This is my preferred place to make a budget comment. I would see Marlene in many different places, but this is where we live and earn our income. This is where we could talk to people who speak the same language as us. Let me put it that way. Marlene, the only thing in closing, I would say that, and I keep hearing Dave, and I would engage him after, saying that 52%, 52 billion is the lower end of, without using the word optimal, of an optimal practical budgetary expenditure. I would say 45 to 52, and I would be more comfortable, but and again, we would have to formally establish that. But the minister is not worried about those things, you know. The minister is not going to adjust expenditure because he knows between this year and next year, he has a 20% increase in gas coming and a 30% increase in oil production coming. And we are in the midst of an energy commodity price super cycle in some regards. So that's what worries me, Dave, Marlene, and Regan, that we, in the context of that, we are not searching deeper or probing to make much needed adjustments that I think on the expenditure side, because the revenue side, as per usual, will bail us out. And that's why I started the conversation with the structure of the Trinidad and Tobago economy and what got us into trouble in the past. Anyway, I thank you all very much and for the opportunity to speak, and take care.
Thank you, Dr. Hussein. I'll invite closing comments with this last question from the other panelists. Question is the balance between growth and poverty alleviation, inclusive growth. Where do we strike that balance? How have we been doing? Closing comments, views on this last question.
I think it's a false dichotomy, because poverty is and poverty levels isn't linked up and connected to the level of growth we have in the economy. So it's no secret that when during high periods of high economic growth, poverty levels normally go down. The huge improvement in poverty levels that we see in the international arena happened because India and China had huge levels of growth and so on that moved millions of people out of poverty. So I think it's a false dichotomy to say the balance between growth and poverty. I think the more prescient dichotomy is the whole difference, the whole balance between poverty and the expenditure levels on social services and so on that government spend. Because if you have high levels of poverty, one of the first ways that people look to deal with it is by creating transfers and subsidies to those individuals, right? And sometimes forgetting that growth and employment is actually the more durable and long-lasting solution to poverty. So I don't think that there's a false dichotomy, because better growth normally means better levels of poverty, unless you have a seriously unequal economic system. And I don't think we have that in Trinidad and Tobago. What we do have is an inefficient architecture in place for managing the economy. And when I talk about inefficient architecture, I talk about things like, for example, the ineffectual or relatively ineffective system we have in place for administering and collecting taxes and so on. The relatively ineffective processes we have for expenditure allocation and for budgetary management and those kinds of things. And I mean, if you go back and look at a number of different publications from the multilateral agencies and from other economists, you know, this is an area that since time immemorial, since independence, we have not particularly gotten a handle of. And these are the areas in which we need to make improvements. Roger mentioned before he left that the minister is banking on the current upsurge in energy prices to deal with some of the issue, and that might be beneficial for Trinidad and Tobago. That's a nice thing. But the problem is we would always go through periods, and sometimes very long period of recessions, where your institutional structure, the comprehensiveness of your institutional structure is what going to make you resilient and what is going to keep us from swinging to high incomes to poverty levels every 10 years and so on. So whereas it is nice to have higher energy prices, if I was the Minister of Finance, I would be praying every day for energy prices to go up. But we need also to increase the level of resilience in the country by improving our institutional structure in a whole myriad of different areas. Marlene talked about the ease of doing business. I would have spoken about the tax regime. There are problems in terms of the foreign exchange markets that you could, the margins that you could correct, and a whole host of other issues. Roger talked about the labor markets and so on. So there are a whole host of issues, structural issues that we need to deal with. And if we don't treat with those things, we would be exposed to the vagaries of the international economy and the increases or decreases in oil prices. So I'll stop there. Yeah. I as well have to vacate. And I want to thank the Department of Economics for inviting me. And I look forward to us continuing this discussion in the year ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Seerattan. Closing comments, Dr. Attzs.
All right. Thanks, Regan. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Roger, for sharing this panel and thoughts and kind of, you know, fertilizing the conversation, so to speak. The first thing I want to say is that we need to speak truth to our circumstances in Trinidad and Tobago. And I think part of our challenge over the years is that we don't speak truth to our circumstances. So we talk about economic growth. Economic growth in Trinidad and Tobago is not just, as Dave called it, a false dichotomy. I think once your economic growth is linked to exogenous factors and you're waiting for the next uptick in energy prices, and to say that that is economic growth in your economy, I think that is not truthful. It is a reality of the nature of our economy, which is why I keep having the conversation about changing the structure, the structural rewiring that is required for Trinidad and Tobago for us to be able to understand our circumstances and to be able to navigate the space effectively. Because economic growth for us is linked to something over which we have no control. So if there is an uptick in prices, as is anticipated, then economic growth for Trinidad and Tobago looks good. And all of the other problems that we have in terms of levels of poverty, levels of unemployment, structural unemployment, so to speak, all of those things get covered in the noise surrounding the uptick in prices. So I think the first thing that we need to do is speak truth to our circumstances and recognize that while, as an economic construct, uptick in prices linked to production in oil and gas, etc., will look like increases in GDP and increases in our economic growth, it is not a truthful reflection. And for many of our population, they can't separate the issues. So when a politician comes out and talks about increases in prices and how the economy is doing well, and when that is part of the narrative when budgets are being presented, our population inculcates that and they see that as the truth when it is not the truth. Because we realized last year when there were negative oil prices that things were looking very sticky and continue to look very sticky for Trinidad and Tobago at a time where our vulnerabilities were laid bare. So we had COVID-19, we had negative oil prices, etc. Our vulnerabilities were all laid bare. So I think the first thing is that we have to appreciate where we are, and our population needs to be part of that conversation and that dialogue. The second thing I want to say is that if ever there was a time for us to start a conversation on structural rewiring, structural adjustment, I think it is now, whether it is externally driven or whether it is internally driven. And I still don't get the sense from those headlines from Budget 2022 that we are serious about moving the pendulum away from our heavy dependence on oil and gas. So I would like to see more in that regard. And the third thing that is related to the first and second points that I made is that we have to do more by way of seminars such as this. And I want to again congratulate Dr. Mohammed, Dr. Deonanan, and the rest of the Department of Economics, of which I am a member. I want to congratulate us for having this conversation, because I think it is important for us to expose the population to these kinds of conversations. I mean, it might seem small. I don't know how many people we have logged in, but every opportunity that there is to contribute to an education on what is happening in Trinidad and Tobago and how we need to collectively help our economic space move forward and transform, I think we want to welcome those opportunities. So again, I just want to close by thanking the department again for hosting this conversation, and to say how much I enjoyed engaging with Roger and Dave. So over to you, moderator. Over to you, Regan.
Thank you, Dr. Attzs, and yes, thank you, Dr. Seerattan, Dr. Hussein. Thank you very much, audience members, for sharing the morning with us. It is, for decades, this department has been with you, with the public, with this country on issues of national importance, regional importance, and certainly this is one of them. And it is with great pleasure that I join. You would have gotten a hint of it, how long these panelists have been in these discussions and debates for many decades. Certainly part of the discussions and in training students that
you didn't just say many decades, did you?
Cumulatively. And not, we are just part of it. We're not part of it. No, we're young, don't worry. But it is a pleasure to be here and to join you all. These conversations will continue. And in this recording, this conversation is being recorded. It will be part of the department's YouTube channel and the university's YouTube channel. And that will certainly be accessible for many, many more occasions beyond just this moment right now. So I bring you greetings once again from the department, UE, and to say thank you. And we look forward to future conversations. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. All the best. Stay safe.